tragic case of domestic violence, the Lindsey incident. Domestic violence is a silent epidemic that often creeps into households, leaving devastation in its wake. At its core, it is a tale of unchecked rage, misplaced power, and systemic gaps. Among the most jarring of these stories is the tragic case of James Christopher Lindsey and his ex-partner, a case filled with betrayal, missed opportunities, and heartbreak. This Chuluota, Florida incident takes center stage in understanding just how catastrophic unchecked violence can become. Chuluota, a tight-knit community nestled near Tampa, Florida, was known for its serenity and suburban charm, qualities tragically shattered on a fateful day. The Lindsey case disrupted the calm, leaving a dark stain on the community's collective memory. It brought home one unsettling realization: even the quietest communities can harbor perilous storms. At the center of this tragedy stood James Christopher Lindsey, 42, a man whose troubled persona would ultimately culminate in a horrifying act of violence. At the time of the crime, Lindsey's volatile relationship with his ex-partner had already earned whispers of concern. Though details about the victim remain guarded, likely due to protecting her identity, what is known paints a chilling picture of a vulnerable woman who suffered greatly at the hands of a man she once trusted. For law enforcement and the community alike, the details of the murder remain haunting. In a frenzied attack, Lindsey stabbed his ex-partner 70 times. Her injuries spoke volumes about the sheer rage and brutality of the assault. The crime wasn't impulsive. It was an eruption of unchecked rage, years in the making. The nature of the attack emphasized the tragic reality that this wasn't merely a loss of control, but a focused, deliberate act meant to end a life. This crime didn't materialize out of thin air. The signs were there, shimmering clearly for those who cared to look. The victim and Lindsey shared a history steeped in allegations of abuse and violence, dating as far back as 2014. Over nearly a decade, the relationship bore scars that foreshadowed this grim ending. Weeks before the brutal killing, Lindsey had been arrested for assaulting the victim, further punctuating the series of violent events that seemed to escalate unchecked. Domestic violence often builds like a slow tide, overflowing until it causes irreparable damage. In Lindsey's case, this tide breached its barriers repeatedly. The justice system's response, his recent arrest for assault, was insufficient to curtail his predatory behavior. The failure to outline strict boundaries, enforce protective orders, or intervene effectively deprived the victim of the critical help she needed. After the murder, Lindsey's actions took another shocking turn. Instead of surrendering to police or coming to grips with what he had done, Lindsey recklessly fled the scene. What followed was a high-speed chase marked by panic and desperation. Driving over 100 miles per hour on Florida's highways, Lindsey defied law enforcement and placed not only his life but the lives of countless innocent bystanders in jeopardy. Lindsey's desperate attempt to escape came to a shocking and violent end. High-speed pursuits often carry the risk of catastrophic accidents, and his was no exception. As he lost control of his vehicle, the car veered out of its path and flipped violently, ejecting Lindsey from the vehicle. He died instantaneously from the impact. In a cruel twist of fate, the man responsible for such unthinkable suffering met his end in equally brutal fashion on the roadside. Chuluota, a quiet town unused to such horrific incidents, was left reeling from the dual tragedies. The victim's murder and Lindsey's spectacular, violent death shook the community deeply. Neighbors grappled with the reality that someone among them had harbored such unchecked violence. The shockwaves extended beyond the victim and perpetrator, reminding everyone how domestic violence extends far past the bounds of private relationships. The investigation following these events sought to document the tragedy in precise detail. Law enforcement retraced Lindsey's last steps, from the location of the violent murder to the exact moments leading to his fatal crash. Pieces of forensic evidence spoke of chaos, a portrait of a man consumed by rage, whose decisions ultimately consumed him too. Autopsy results revealed the trauma of the crash, but deeper insights were obtained from the murder weapon and gruesome crime scene. At its core, this case is an example of the devastating cycle of domestic violence, a cycle that traps both victim and perpetrator in ways that escalate toward irreversible tragedy. Lindsey displayed the hallmark patterns of a controlling and abusive partner, escalating from verbal and physical intimidation to acts of unforgivable rage. These cycles often remain intact due to a lack of societal awareness and an overburdened system that often overlooks warning signs until it is too late. What is perhaps most heart-wrenching about this case is the glaring number of missed opportunities to intervene. Lindsey's arrest for assault weeks earlier was a pivotal moment for systemic intervention, but it was largely squandered. Measures like enhanced enforcement of restraining orders or mandated therapy could have changed the trajectory of this story. Instead, gaps in the system sealed the victim's fate and enabled Lindsey's rapid descent into fatal violence. To better understand how such a tragedy unfolded, it is imperative to examine Lindsey through a psychological lens. His actions suggest a man who struggled with deep-seated anger and a desire for dominance. His history of violent behavior toward his ex-partner reflected controlling tendencies, aggressive outbursts, and a perceived entitlement to harm. In analyzing similar cases, patterns emerge that can offer critical clues to identifying and stopping abusers before they act out lethally. The victim's story, though not fully documented in public records, deserves equal focus. Her life was tragically cut short, but her suffering did not begin on the day of her murder. The years of abuse she endured demonstrate how victims often become trapped in a web of fear, guilt, and helplessness. She, like many, may have faced isolation or lacked access to safe options for escape, an all-too-common scenario for victims of domestic violence. This case stands as one of many strikingly similar instances of domestic violence that escalate to deadly proportions. Studying similar cases provides insight into the broader implications. How are these patterns allowed to fester unchanged? What barriers prevent victims from receiving help? And why do communities so often fail to mobilize even when the warnings are visible? Another layer of complexity in domestic violence cases is often obsessive behavior, including stalking. Perpetrators like Lindsey frequently use stalking as a means to control and monitor their victims, building tension that eventually explodes into violence. Though evidence of such behavior wasn't explicitly cited in this case, it is a concerning trend that overlaps in countless other tragedies. While the justice system often bears the brunt of criticism in cases like these, it faces undeniable challenges in responding to domestic violence crises. Police and legal processes frequently walk a thin line between respecting personal freedoms and safeguarding those at risk. For Lindsey's victim, however, the system's procedural delays and lack of aggressive action cost her everything. In the wake of such tragedies, communities must band together to heal, recover, and learn. Local victim advocacy programs often see spikes in outreach after such instances, as survivors emerge emboldened to tell their stories. Counseling efforts, public memorials, and education campaigns can help neighbors rebuild trust and foster a sense of accountability in supporting at-risk individuals. True crime cases like this one are often thrust into the national spotlight. News reports covering Lindsey's actions helped spread awareness of the dangers of domestic violence, encouraging open conversations around preventative measures. Yet media platforms must tread carefully, ensuring their coverage respects the victim and doesn't glorify the perpetrator. What many fail to realize is how domestic violence feeds into broader cycles of societal harm. Families, colleagues, friends, and even children linked to either the victim or offender often carry lasting scars. True crime audiences are well positioned to explore the ripple effects and demand accountability in how society handles abusive situations before they spiral into tragedy. The numbers speak volumes about the severity of the domestic violence crisis. In Florida alone, domestic violence incidents account for hundreds of homicides annually. Nationally, nearly 1 in 4 women experience intimate partner violence during their lifetime. Tragically, these statistics represent lives lost and pain inflicted on far too many people. Systemic inadequacies persist in domestic violence enforcement. Protective orders often aren't enforced promptly, and interventions such as counseling are inconsistently mandated. Addressing these gaps remains critical in preventing recurring tragedies. Lindsey's case demonstrates the costs of a system that reacts too slowly to escalating patterns of violence. Educating communities is one of the most impactful ways to intervene in domestic violence situations. Neighbors, colleagues, and even acquaintances often serve as the first line of defense. Knowing how to identify the warning signs and where to turn for help can mean the difference between life and death. In the aftermath of tragedies, resources for survivors of abuse play a pivotal role. Hotlines, shelters, and counseling centers offer lifelines to those trying to escape abusive relationships. However, these resources are only as effective as their accessibility and public awareness. Efforts to tackle domestic violence must be consistently bolstered by legal reform, stricter penalties for abusers, robust survivor support systems, and early intervention programs are among the reforms pushed by advocacy groups. Through relentless reform, the legal system can begin to address its current gaps. The Lindsey case remains a cautionary tale of how domestic violence destroys lives when left unchecked. A woman lost her life, a community mourned, and a system failed to act decisively. This tragedy must be a catalyst for change, driving intervention at every level to ensure no one else suffers the same fate. Let this story awaken a sense of urgency. Support domestic violence prevention programs, learn to recognize warning signs, advocate for policy reform, and most importantly, extend compassion and help to those in need. Together, we can honor the memory of victims by fighting tirelessly for a future free from the grip of abuse.